We'd finished discussing isinglass. Egg albumin is next. It's also a protein made by drying egg white, though fresh egg white is preferable to the dried. And in its action is similar to gelatin, and the factors affecting the action are similar to gelatin. And when it should be used, I don't think it should be used on white wines at all because it has a very pronounced tendency to overfine. It should only be used in red wines to reduce astringency. And it's prepared like isinglass by soaking overnight in cold water and stirring to and through a screen remove the lumps made up in a 1% solution. And the amounts used are similar to gelatin. Now bentonite. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on bentonite because it's the most widely used of all the clarifying agents that we have at our disposal. If there is one clarified agent that we can say is the universal fining agent, it is bentonite because it can be used on every type of wine. And as given in your lecture outline, it's a montmorillonite clay, and this is an embracing term for aluminum silicate clays. In other words, the montmorillonite clays are aluminum silicate clays, and they have a definite expanding crystal lattice structure. Well, you'll see the bentonite furnished in the form of powder or very small pellets. If you break that down, you'll find that the structure is a crystal lattice in form. And of all the bentonites that are available around the world, there are European bentonites as well as American bentonites. The Wyoming bentonites, those mined in a certain area in Wyoming, are particularly suitable for wine clarification. And the reason they are particularly suitable for wine clarification is because sodium is the dominant cation present. You can see that the montmorillonite clays are mixtures of magnesium, sodium, calcium oxides, aluminum oxide, silicon dioxide, and of course water. And the proportion of these various cations and also the anions is going to vary from one deposit to another. But the Wyoming clay is very high in sodium content, which makes it particularly suitable for wine clarification. Now this hydrated aluminum silicate, because those are the main constituents that are present in the bentonite, has a molecular weight of about 720. And yes? Because I'll go into that in detail later on. You're anticipating. The bentonite exists as exceedingly small plates. Visualize it as a plate. The thickness of the plate is about 10 angstroms. And the width is about 5,000 angstroms. So you can see that they're very, very small plates. Now, the form in which the bentonite exists, as well as the charges that are present, is what makes bentonite a good fining agent. These plates are negatively charged. In other words, the net charge on the plate is negative. And that's due to the fact that the flat side of the plate contains negative charges. The edges of the plate contain positive charges. but you only have 10 angstrom width or thickness of the plate compared with the 5,000 angstrom width or surface area on the flat side of the plate. So the net result is that the plate is negatively charged. And this negative charge will attract exchangeable cations, and they of course will form a layer around the plate. So bentonite is an exchange material. It will exchange because it will attract cations, and it will give up sodium when it attracts the cations. And the exchange capacity is about 1 milliequivalent per gram of bentonite. So if you add 1 pound per 1,000 gallons, you'll exchange about 3 milligrams per liter of sodium. You exchange about 3 milligrams per liter of sodium that is attached to the bentonite for cations in the wine. Now when bentonite is soaked in water, and that's the approved method of preparing it for use as a fine agent, these plates, these very small plates, separate more or less completely. And in doing so, they will form eventually a homogeneous colloidal suspension. It's not a solution, it's a colloidal suspension. And that's why you soak it in water, is because these plates will then separate and tremendously increase the effective surface for reaction. So much so that 1 gram of sodium bentonite will have a area of 750 square meters. So it's like carbon in that respect. The reason carbon is such a good absorbent agent is because it presents a tremendous surface. Bentonite does the same thing. I specified sodium bentonite because the sodium bentonites swell the most of any of the bentonites that are available. And by swelling, I mean that they separate into separate plates. They have to swell because these plates are packed together. They have to swell and the plates separate in order to offer this tremendous surface from a very small amount of bentonite. In the calcium form, that's another very common form of bentonite. Some of the bentonites are principally calcium as compared with others which are principally sodium. If you have a bentonite in which the cation is principally calcium, then these plates tend to clump together. You put them into water and they don't separate and swell. And the fining power of bentonite is almost directly proportional to the degree of swelling that occurs, in other words, to the degree of plate separation that occurs when it is put into a water and allowed to swell and finally form a colloidal suspension. And also these calcium bentonites don't tend to stay in suspension nearly as well as the sodium bentonites. They tend to clump together and to fall out, whereas the sodium bentonites tend to disperse and to remain in suspension. Now this colloidal property of bentonite, of course, is of basic importance in enology. The fact that in a water solution it is in a colloidal suspension. It is a colloidal mixture. The bentonite will absorb nearly 5 times its own weight of water, or its own volume of water, I should say, rather than weight. It'll swell faster in hot water than in cold, but it swells only slightly in alcohol. So then that's another good reason why you prepare bentonite as a water solution and then add it to the wine rather than to prepare it directly as a wine solution. Because if you add it directly to wine, it'll only swell to a fraction of the extent that it'll swell in water. So you only get a fraction of the fining power of the bentonite.
Does it make any difference whether you use warm or hot water when making it up?
Yes, it does. Use hot water because you'll get even more swelling than if you use cold water. The particle size of the bentonite, as I say, it furnished in all forms ranging from a very fine powder to actually small bead-like particles. And the particle size does influence the rate of swelling. Both very fine powder and very coarse particles will swell more slowly than do particles of intermediate size. So you don't want either a very fine powder or a very coarse particle. You want an intermediate size particle to get the greatest swelling rate. Now there are basically two actions that are involved in protein absorption. Electrostatic precipitation. As the name would indicate, this action is accomplished by neutralizing positively charged particles either by proton transfer or cation exchange. An example, and one of the reasons why bentonite is so effective in removing protein, is that bentonite will bind the proteins through their amino groups. So its cation exchange or proton transfer is responsible for the electrostatic precipitation. In other words, it's a charge deal. The other main method of the action of bentonite is adsorption. And the main vehicle for absorption, of course, would be hydrogen bonding. The proteins in wines at the wine pH are normally positively charged, and they're absorbed by charge neutralization. In other words, the main or the net charge on the bentonite is negative. The proteins are positively charged. When these particles get together, there's a charge neutralization. And they may then be absorbed by hydrogen bonding. And occasionally some of your protein is there, and other particles also, as negatively charged particles. And the bentonite can still react to some extent because of the fact that the edges of these plates are positively charged. So bentonite is not powerless to act against negatively charged particles because it does have positive charges on the edges of the plates. Any questions at this stage?
I'm talking about it swells faster in hot water than cold.
Right.
And I read in preparing you're supposed to put it in hot water, then let it cool, and then heat up again. Is that
I'll go into that detail later on. Now I want to discuss a number of the factors that influence protein removal with bentonite. First, the type of bentonite. And as I've said earlier, the ability to remove bentonite depends upon the degree of swelling, because the more you swell, the more surface you expose and make available for reaction with protein. And that's, of course, why the sodium bentonites are preferred, because they are the greatest in swelling power. Naturally, the amount of bentonite that's added. We can add bentonite, effective dosages of bentonite generally range from 1 pound up, with 10 pounds being a pretty massive dose, so I have known of cases where as much as 50 and 60 pounds of bentonite per 1,000 gallons are added. But I'd say the usual range of dosage is somewhere between 1 and 10 pounds per 1,000 gallons. And the method of preparing the bentonite for use, in other words, the method of pre-swelling. And of course, pre-swelling in warm water is the most effective method. And I'll give you the details on that a bit later. The acidity of the wine also is an important factor in the removal of protein by bentonite. The more acid the wine, the more effective the bentonite is in removing protein. And that's due to the fact that the more acid the wine, the more positive charge the protein will be, because your protein, of course, is made up of both positive and minus charges, depending upon the pH, and the lower the pH, the more positive charges will be on the protein. And since the bentonite is largely negative, that'll make the reaction more effective. As an example, to find at 3.6 will require, say, let's say 8 pounds of bentonite, just an example. To find the same wine, if you lower the pH to 3.0, from 3.6 to 3.0, you'll require about 1/4 as much of bentonite. In other words, 2 pounds of bentonite at 3.0 pH, 8 pounds of bentonite at 3.6 pH. So you can see that the pH is a very important factor in the action of the bentonite. Tannin content. The tannin lowers the efficiency of the protein removal, because the combination of protein and tannin has a negative charge. And your bentonite is mainly positively charged. So the greater the tannin content of the wine, the less efficient bentonite would be in removing protein. And the composition of the wine. Here's one that bothered enologists for quite some time until I think it was Dr. Rankin, the Australian Wine Research Institute, came up with the answer to it. I think he's the one that's responsible. And that is the fact that wines that were ion exchanged with a resin in the cationic form, in other words, sodium form or hydrogen form, would frequently find poorly with bentonite. Find the wines before ion exchange, they find very well. Ion exchange them and then try to find them with bentonite, and quite often the find was very poor. The protein removal was minimal, where before it had been maximal. And that was found to be due to the removal of the divalent cations in the ion exchange, because the divalent cations are largely removed due to the fact that they are more heavily charged than the monovalent. And the divalent cations are absolutely necessary for flocculation to occur when you are trying to remove protein with bentonite. To be exact, it requires that the concentration of the divalent cations, that is calcium and magnesium, are the two main ones present, naturally present, that the concentration be above 4 milliequivalents per liter. As long as the concentration of the calcium and magnesium together is above 4 milliequivalents per liter, then the fine would proceed normally. If it is reduced below 4 milliequivalents per liter, then quite often the fine went very poorly. Now, if you are faced sometime with the necessity to remove protein from a wine which has been ion exchanged, and if your concentration of the calcium and magnesium is below this absolute minimum of 4 milliequivalents per liter, you can still go ahead and get a successful finding just by adding magnesium chloride to the wine and building the concentration up to the required level. But of course, the recommended procedure is to find before ion exchange. The alcohol content has an effect. The high alcohol content increases the effectiveness of the fining. So the higher the alcohol content, everything else being equal, the more effective the fine will be. In temperature, we've already spoken of that. The warmer the wine within limits, the more efficient the fining. And the last heading that I have is other. If you have wines that are high in polysaccharides or gums, they will usually fine poorly with bentonite because the polysaccharides and gums act as protective colloids and prevent the action of the bentonite on the protein. Also, as I mentioned earlier, protective colloids can be formed by heating. So even though the wines fine better at higher temperatures, you are always in danger of forming protective colloids, and that can prevent the action of the bentonite on the protein. And particularly if you're working with wines made from moldy grapes, for example, Botrytis cinerea infected grapes, the so-called noble rot. If you're working with wines made from them, you'll have a great deal of difficulty in finding them because they're going to be high in protective colloids. So if you do run into this situation, don't use bentonite, use a protein, a positively charged protein to fine. Gelatin or casein, and then followed by bentonite to remove any excess protein from the fining agent. Any questions?
Could you go back a little bit and go over the electrostatic precipitation again?
It's a charge neutralization.
How's that different from the hydrogen bonding and the adsorption?
Well, the charge neutralization is the fact that the bentonite is negatively charged, has a net negative charge, and the particles that you're trying to remove are positively charged. So the charge neutralization allows the the substance to approach each other close enough for hydrogen bonding to form.
So how are they really different? I mean, you have to have the charge neutralization for the electrostatic precipitation, and you also have it for the adsorption.
Well, hydrogen bonding is just a bond between the nitrogen and the hydrogen.
So then with the electrostatic precipitation, the bentonite doesn't come out with the protein, or does it?
Electrostatic precipitation is just a term describing what is happening.
Oh, I don't see how the two are different. The electrostatic precipitation and adsorption.
Electrostatic precipitation covers the charge neutralization plus the hydrogen bonding. It's just a term covering those two reactions. Is that clear?
I how tannin lowers the efficiency of bentonite fining? By what action does it?
Oh, if you have moldy grapes, they're very difficult to find with bentonite because they're very high in protective colloids.
That was my question, I'm sorry, I'm not speaking now. I was asking about tannin.
Tannin?
You said tannin lowers the efficiency?
Yes, because it will act with the protein to form negatively charged particles, and your bentonite is primarily negatively charged. Any other questions?
Do you use casein as a positively charged protein as an example?
Yes. Casein or gelatin, either one.
How does alcohol increase the effectiveness?
It has an effect upon the dielectric constant. I'll go into that in quite some detail when we discuss protein fining. You seem to be way ahead of me today. Guess you're usually way ahead for that matter. Well, where may bentonite fining be used on any wine? And it's particularly good on stuck clarification. In other words, where you've been fining an organic fine agent and you get a stuck clarification, you've used too much of the fining agent, then bentonite is very effective in breaking the stuck clarification and causing the wine to clear. How it's prepared for use. Besides the using a high sodium bentonite, the method of preparation and the method of addition to the wine is of equal importance, or maybe even so, more so. 8/10 of a pound of bentonite per gallon of water. Now that's more than will remain in a colloidal suspension after it's fully swollen. But it's you add 8/10 of a pound per gallon because you want to make as strong a suspension as you can because you don't want to dilute your wine with any more water than necessary. In fact, the federal regulations, if I remember rightly, allow the use of a water suspension of bentonite if the dilution does not exceed 1%. In other words, if your wine is not diluted more than 1% by the addition of the bentonite suspension. You sift it in with stirring, and you have the same problem with lumping that you have if you are sifting flour into water. It must be sifted in and agitated violently to prevent lumping, because if the lumps form, they're very difficult to break up. So sift in the stirring, and the agitation is accomplished in these tanks, and they have, well, most of the wineries have tanks equipped for the preparation of a bentonite slurry with agitators in the tanks and with pumps and also with a steam injection system. So you start the steam injection system, you start your agitators, and then you start sifting the bentonite into the tank. Now, on large tanks, they use quite often the same type of device that's used for feeding powder into a filter, because it distributes it in a sifting manner. And you continue this sifting until the complete dosage of bentonite has been added to the water, and you continue the stirring and the injection of steam until the temperature has reached about 120 degrees Fahrenheit. You let stand for 24 hours, and then again agitate with steam until you bring the temperature up to 120 degrees Fahrenheit again. And many people use it after that second heating. Those who want to get the full power out of the bentonite and use as little bentonite as possible will let stand for 24 hours after the second heating and repeat the heating and agitation the third time. And then allow it to stand until it gets down to practically cellar temperature, and it's ready for use. And some winemakers add a little deodorizing carbon to the bentonite slurry because they feel that it picks up or removes the chance of any slight off odors being imparted by the bentonite to the wine. Others do not bother to do this. Now, the method of introducing the bentonite into the wine is of equal importance with the method of preparing it. The worst method is to dump the charge or the dosage of bentonite into a tank of wine and then start to stir the tank of wine, because you will only utilize a fraction of the finding power of the bentonite, because when you dump it in, you're introducing a large amount of bentonite to a small amount of wine, and you're going to strip the small amount of wine the bentonite comes in contact with. So the way to do it is, this is a pump. Pumping into another tank, and on the suction side of the pump you have another pump, and this in turn is hooked to your bentonite slurry tank. As the wine is pumped from one tank to another, your proportion pump, which is hooked to your bentonite slurry, pumps into the suction side of the transfer pump, and you regulate the flow so that when the last bit of wine comes out of this tank, the last bit of slurry comes out of this. Now, if you go to the trouble of preparing the bentonite properly and introducing it properly, you can use or accomplish your desired clarification with about 1/4 of the amount of bentonite that you would need if you just dumped the bentonite into the wine and made up a slurry in the wine itself.
This is, these hoses are coming out of the bottom of the first tank and going into the bottom of the second tank?
Yeah.
Question. When you're doing cloning trials with bentonite, you usually add a certain quantity directly to a fixed quantity of wine rather than regulating it in this way. You get a different result.
The nearest we can approach this in the laboratory is to take the dosage of bentonite that you want to add to, say, 100 milliliters of wine or 200 milliliters of wine, mix it up in 5 milliliters of wine, and then dump that into the 100 milliliters of wine. But it's still not exactly equivalent to what we can do in the winery. In fact, in the winery we'll get by with less than we need in the lab if we follow this procedure. Any other questions or comments on bentonite?
Yeah. Could you said you sift it, stir it in, agitate with steam, bring the temperature up. This is done 3 times altogether over a period of 3 days, 36 hours?
Right.
And how, you said after the second time doing it, you reduce it, or you get more out of it doing it once more, or waiting to do it once more?
Right.
Is there any figures on that?
Oh, you probably gain another 10 to 15% by heating it the 3rd time. A lot of the wineries have 5 to 10,000 gallon stainless steel tanks equipped for making their bentonite slurry. Others smaller according to the size of the tank. And they'll usually make up about a week's supply at a time.
And then you can let this stuff sit after you make it?
Once it's been made properly, it will stand until it starts to mold.
How long is that?
You're safe if you use it within a week.
How long is that?
You're safe if you use it within a week. Well, let's see. Anything else on bentonite? Pectic enzymes. There are a number of... Yes?
One thing on the bentonite, what is its effect on wine quality?
The only adverse effect it has is a stripping effect. It will carry down other constituents besides the protein. On white wines, it will, if used in fairly large amounts, it will reduce can even reduce the feel of the wine, the body of the wine. It can reduce some of the aromatic constituents of the wine. In reds, it will definitely remove pigment to a greater or less extent, depending upon the amount used and the type of the wine, and will also lessen the body feel. So that's why you use as little bentonite as possible. Also because bentonite produces the most lees of any fine agent that we use. Are we ready to proceed to pectic enzymes?
The effect on quality, you said it takes some pigment out of red wines?
It always takes out more or less of the pigment.
What about aromatic constituents?
If used in fairly large amounts, it can remove some of the aromatic constituents also. It's a great adsorbing agent. And anything that can hydrogen bond, you're going to lose some of it.
And then on the white wines, you said it just loses some of the texture. It becomes thin.
And can also remove some of the aromatic constituents.
Is it still the favored way of removing proteins from wine?
Bentonite's still the favorite way. In fact, it's the best method we have for removing proteins. Prolytic enzymes are a possibility.
Do the wineries at all try to, if they plan to use bentonite on the red wine, tend to leave them on the skins a bit too long to get a bit too much tannin, too much color, and then use the bentonite so that they don't end up with too little? Methanol or...
Which wineries are you talking about? Which part of the state? If you're talking about the San Joaquin, yes, they try to get all the color out that they can because they're dealing with light-colored grapes on the whole. The North Coast, no, as a general rule.
How widely is it used in, say, the premium wineries? Is it
Bentonite?
pretty much a routine thing that they do on all wines?
On whites, the majority of the whites are bentonite fine. Occasionally a winery will not find a wine if they find that it's naturally protein stable or they think they can get by with it. No winemaker likes to use clarifying agents unless he has to, unless he's trying to correct some deficiencies.
How does sparkaloid compare with methanol?
It doesn't. Sparkaloid is, the principal constituent in sparkaloid is agar-agar. And it does have a place in very special cases, but it doesn't have near the versatility and uniform or wide spectrum use that bentonite has.
What would be that special case where you use sparkaloid?
Occasionally in red wines, sparkaloid is the most effective fine agent there is.
Is this for one particular, is this for protein or is this for other?
No, not in red wines. You don't have a protein problem in reds. It's a pigment problem, unstable pigment. Or a combination of pigment and tannins, I should say. I'm going to have trouble getting going on Petit enzymes. Well, there are a number of companies that produce them, and they all have them, or market them under trade names. Pectinol is a Roman horse product, probably one of the best known and probably one of the most widely used in the wine industry. It's a trade name for their pectic enzyme preparation. And these pectic enzymes are produced by mold action, and they contain two enzymes. That is PG, polygalactorinase, and PE, the pectin methylesterase. So you can have, if you add pectic enzymes to juices or to wines, you have two actions going because you have two enzymes. You have an demethoxylation reactions. In other words, the methoxy groups are being split off. And you're also having a splitting up of the chains because the pectin is a chain of a number of galacturonic acids. Generally believed to be 32 galacturonic acids hooked together to form chains, and that is your pectin. 32 galacturonic acid units hooked together. So when you add your mixture of your two enzymes to it, you'll start breaking up those chains into the individual galacturonic acid molecules. You also start demethoxylating, in other words, splitting off the methoxyl groups. You want me to put the formula for pectin on the board or not?
Yeah.
Okay. I won't put on all 32 of them. And so on. So one of your enzymes is splitting off this methoxyl group, the other one is breaking the bond between two of the galacturonic acids.
What do they worry about the carboxyl group for?
Don't,
Why do they put something in there to break it off?
because that's what they get when they make the pectic enzymes by mold action. Now, in native pectin, about 2/3 of these methoxyl groups are esterified with methanol. So when you introduce the enzyme and you start breaking off these methoxyl groups, deasterifying, you're going to liberate methanol. And that's why we have trouble if we try to make citrus brandy, for example, or peach brandy, or pear brandy, or prune brandy, because those fruits are high in pectin, and the natural enzymes will demethoxylate, deasterify, and will liberate methanol. And you have a great deal of difficulty trying to keep the distillate within the limits prescribed by law for methanol content. These enzymes, as they are furnished to the user, may be mixed with sugar. That's one of the very common ways to mix them, because unless they are greatly diluted, they are so concentrated that you'd have a great deal of difficulty in getting the dosage that you want to distribute within your juice or wine. So they are diluted very extensively with either sugar or with diatomaceous earth or flour, anything that's compatible with the product to which they are to be added. Now, some of the factors affecting them are temperature. As one would expect, the activity increases with increasing temperature, and they are active over the range of 32 to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. And of course, much more active at the 120 degrees Fahrenheit temperature than at the 32. And fairly recent, within the last several years, they have developed strains that are active up to about 132 to 134 degrees Fahrenheit. Because being proteins themselves, they of course are subject to heat denaturation. And that's why there's an upper limit, upper temperature at which they will lose all their activity.
Why would you want to heat a wine that high?
Because the higher the temperature, the faster they work. If you work them at 32 degrees, it'll take weeks for the action. If you work at 132 degrees, it's a matter of 30 minutes.
Yeah, but if you leave a wine at 132 degrees for 30 minutes, you're practically ruined.
Really?
Well, it's not going to help you. Is it worth it to raise the wine or the temperature of a wine that much just to get the pectin so fast?
Some winemakers seem to think so. At usual cellar temperature, it's an overnight treatment with pectin. Say you want to clear up white juice prior to fermentation, add pectin, allow it to stand overnight. Not pectin, add pectic enzymes, allowed to stand overnight. No, where they use at high temperatures, to be serious and answer your question rather than facetious, is in the use of juices for making concentrate, which have to be cleaned up before they're concentrated. And to clean them up, they're heated, because you must make the juices sterile in order to keep them until they are concentrated, and it also greatly aids the clarification. So they'll heat them up to around 130 to 35 degrees and add the pectic enzyme, and they'll get their action in a very short period of time. About 140 degrees is just about the inactivation temperature. You get around 140 degrees, you start to inactivate your enzyme, and the higher temperature you reach, the faster inactivation, 160 degrees Fahrenheit, you're going to get complete inactivation in a very short period of time. How it's used, it can be added to crushed grapes to facilitate pressing, because it'll get rid of some of that slime that quite often makes pressing of white grapes difficult. And of course, to facilitate clearing prior to fermentation. You can even add it to wines. If you have some wines that are difficult to clear because they are high in pectin content, suppose occasionally you will run across wines made from grapes that are extremely low in native pectic enzyme content. All of our vinifera grapes have more or less naturally occurring pectic enzyme. But the amount of pectic enzyme is going to vary considerably from one grape to another, and also within the same variety of grape in different areas and different seasons. And occasionally you will get a grape that will not clear itself naturally of the pectin, that is, the wines are made from it, because of the insufficiency of the native pectic enzyme. And also, if you heat juices prior to fermentation up to the point where you're inactivating the native enzyme, then after you've cooled them down to the temperature below the inactivation, it's necessary to add pectic enzyme or your wines will not clear. This is particularly true of reds where you've been using heat to extract red color. It's absolutely essential that pectic enzyme be added to the juice after the temperature is reached below the inactivation temperature. Yes? It's much preferred to add it prior to fermentation rather than after. There are several reasons for this. One, the main one is that you would suffer less wine loss if you add it prior to fermentation than after, because after fermentation you're not going to form much lees, whereas prior to fermentation your juice has a lot of material and it's going to drop out, and if you add pectic enzyme, the increase in the amount that's going to drop out is very, very small compared with the total dropout in lees selling during fermentation, after fermentation. The methanol production in vinifera, or wines made from vinifera grapes, is very small. I do not know of any case where the methyl alcohol legal allowable content has been exceeded in vinifera wines, at least in this country, from the addition of pectic enzymes. It's not very widely used in California because, unfortunately, being a natural product produced by bacterial action, or mold action I should say, it's a mixture of enzymes, and unfortunately the producers don't know too much about what's in their product, and sufficiently often to be a matter of concern where it's used in whites, it will result in increased browning. So that's why the winemakers are a bit reluctant to use pectic enzymes, one of the reasons why. How it's added? It's either dissolved or suspended depending upon the filler you use. If it's a sugar filler, well, you dissolve it in your wine or your juice. And of course, if it's a diatomaceous earth powder filler, then it's suspended. But anyway, it's just added and then the juice agitated. If you're going to use it on crushed grapes, then the material is usually added at the crusher, sprinkled on the grapes in the crusher hopper. Amount used from 0.001 to 0.005% pectic enzyme. So you can see why it's necessary to use a filler, because you're dealing with a very, very small amount, because this is a highly concentrated enzyme. Amount used from 1 to 2 pounds, this is of the commercial preparation, per 1,000 gallons of the single strength. And all these manufacturers have various strength preparation ranging from what they call single strength to 10 times strength. Any questions?
You mentioned that one of the reasons that winemakers don't want to use this is they aren't sure of the actual mixture of enzymes they're getting.
Neither is the manufacturer.
What are some of the, are there other reasons that it's not used?
It's fairly expensive, and it can be added to crushed white grapes. Supposedly it'll increase the juice yield, though the reaction is not predictable. Sometimes it will increase the juice yield, other times it won't. It can be added to white juice prior to fermentation to help clarify the juice. Sometimes it helps, sometimes it doesn't. It depends upon the natural pectic enzyme content of the juice. And as I say, it's a fairly expensive preparation. If you look into literature on pectic enzymes, that is the commercial usage of pectic enzymes, you'll find that all of the tests for the fining power or the action of the pectic enzymes are entirely empirical. Because we've done quite a lot of work on that in our laboratory, and we've assayed them for P activity, PM activity, or PG activity rather, and there's no correlation whatsoever between those two activities, the two main enzymes, and their action on juices or wines. So that's another reason why the people are looking to use it, because they have no way of measuring its action. Any other questions? Yes?
What about finding I heard using sparkle oil to compound bentonite leaves. I'm not selling sparkle oil. Is there anything to that?
Not that I know of. Of course, a lot of things I don't know.